This is the Onshore Podcast, the podcast about religion, atheism, and everything in between.
Good morning, listeners. I hope you've enjoyed your weekend so far.
Everyone's gone to the moon.
Over the course of making this podcast, I've had the privilege of hosting some distinguished figures from the world of academia. Guests like Professor James McGrath, a leading global expert on the New Testament, and Dr. Tim Coulson, Professor of Zoology at Oxford University, have generously joined me for insightful conversations, and it was especially rewarding when both mentioned they had enjoyed the experience.
Everyone's gone to the moon.
Earlier this year, I became interested in inviting a more well-known public figure to the show. After reaching out to several individuals, I was pleased when Jonathan King responded to me cordially in April and agreed to participate. Most British people my age will likely remember him from Entertainment USA, a primetime TV show in which he highlighted American popular culture and explored the unique aspects of various US cities. In my early teens, I developed a fascination with the pop music of the 1960s and 70s, which led me to learn more about Mr. King's contributions to the music industry. His haunting hit, Everyone's Gone to the Moon, recorded while he was still a student at Cambridge University, became a major chart success. He continued to have hits sporadically during the late 1960s and 1970s, with songs such as Una Paloma Blanca reaching number 5 in 1975. As I became more immersed in music from that era and started to amass a collection of vinyl 45 records, I discovered that Mr. King's influence went beyond his solo hits. He wrote and produced tracks under various pseudonyms, including the 1970 number 2 hit, Johnny Reggae, under the name The Piglets.
Reggae. Here comes Johnny Reggae. Johnny Reggae, Reggae, lay it on me.
Additionally, he was instrumental in launching the career of Genesis, producing their debut album with the biblically inspired title From Genesis to Revelation. Breaking away from major music corporations, Mr. King established UK Records, one of the first independent record labels, which helped launch the career of a number of acts, such as the band 10cc. In the 1990s, after a successful stint in television, he continued shaping the music industry in Britain by revitalising the Brit Awards and helping secure Britain's last Eurovision win. In 2000, I bought his CD box set, King of Hits, which showcased his broad and varied career. Like many artists, his work is very much a mixed bag, and by his own admission, some of his creations are prone to levity and perhaps haven't stood the test of time. But there are some gems within his canon. One track that has stood out for me over the years is the quirky Let It All Hang Out, a minor hit in 1969.
No parking, bad as suicide, hot dog, my razor broke water, driven up the spine, but I don't care, let it all hang out.
However, just months after I bought the box set, I was surprised to read about Mr. King's arrest on child sex offences. He was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. After his release, his influence in the music world faded, though he continued to produce music and a number of films that challenged the legitimacy of his convictions.
So man walking upside down, my TV's on the blink, make Galileo look like a boy scout. Sorry about that, let it all hang out.
Now, as he approaches 80 years of age, he continues to run a YouTube channel where he shares his thoughts on topics ranging from the music industry to politics and the criminal justice system. However, to the best of my knowledge, Mr. King's last extended interview with an entity other than a police force took place over a decade ago with the independent newspaper. That's why I was eager to have him join me on the podcast. For those familiar with the Onshore podcast, you know that this is a space for open, judgment-free conversations where people from all walks of life can share their stories and perspectives. For example, in our first series, we interviewed a convicted criminal who had spent an extended period in prison, reinforcing my belief that everyone, no matter their past, has something to contribute to a meaningful conversation. I began my conversation with Mr. King by discussing how I first became aware of his work and his significant contributions to the music industry over the years. Good morning, Mr. King. I think most people my age encountered you initially as the host of Entertainment USA in the 1980s. Well, I remember around that time seeing an old clip of you on Top of the Pops back in 1965, and I remember my late father saying to me, "Oh, that's Jonathan King, you know, the guy who presents Entertainment USA," and I couldn't see it. But it's quite strange, isn't it, that that clip of you performing Everyone's Gone to the Moon has survived, because by all accounts, many of the Top of the Pops clips from the 60s and 70s no longer exist. And you hear these stories of performances by the Beatles being found in attics and so on. How was it that that clip survived?
Yes, interestingly enough, that was, I think what they did was they had their 100th anniversary or something, and they rang round all the people who were on the first few shows, and I was on the very first London show in 1965. They wanted to ask all our permission if they could show the old footage. And everyone else they asked, because it was like 10 years later, said no, they couldn't show it because they looked so much younger and prettier.
Yeah.
I was never young or pretty, so I said, oh yes, fine, show it. So as a result, it featured in that show, and most of the other ones that were in the early shows were wiped. Yeah, that's what the BBC was doing in those days. So as a result, they kept that old clip of me in 1965 because it had featured in one of the anniversary shows.
Right, gotcha. Later on in my youth, I became very interested in the pop music of the 60s and 70s and started collecting vinyl 45 records. I used to go to a second-hand record shop here in Liverpool, and I used to buy 45s, a lot of 45s from them. And the Guinness Book of British Hit Singles was like my Bible back in the day. And I bought a clutch of 45s and I took them to the guy who was checking out, and he's leafing through these singles, and I'd picked up a single by the Weathermen, and I thought, okay, I've not heard of them, and I'll see what it's all about. And as the guy at the till is leafing through the records, he said, Jonathan King? And I henceforth became aware of your involvement in the music industry, which hitherto I'd only known you as the host of Entertainment USA. I went on to buy the King of Hits box set back in 2000 there or thereabouts.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that has all of your records under the various guises and so on, and I still listen to some of your music to this day. So the podcast is largely about religion, although we'll touch on your other pursuits. You had quite a traditional English upbringing, Charterhouse, Cambridge University. You must have been exposed to Christianity from quite an early age. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I suppose so. My parents were not particularly religious in any way. I think we went to the odd Christmas carol service, but no real connection in those early years. And then, of course, when I started going to school, it was a bit more pronounced. Not really until I got to Charterhouse when I was, 13 or so. And there they had a wonderful, I've been to it many times, it's a wonderful chapel, which you had to go to every morning at 9 o'clock or whatever for like 15 minutes. And I also got quite friendly with a couple of the chaplains there. So yes, I suppose I became interested in it. Not so much the religious sound as the musical sound, because the chapel at Charterhouse has the most marvellous organ with the deepest, bassest sound I've ever heard ever. And in fact, I spent most of my music career trying to emulate that deep bass sound that sort of hit you in the pit of your stomach and never quite managing to do so.
Okay, so did you dabble with religion during your youth? Was there any time when you thought to yourself, the words of the Bible tell me about God or whatever? Did you ever have any belief in an almighty God?
Not really, no. I never dabble in anything. I either dive straight in and swim for 5 hours, which I do every day if I can, or I don't go in at all. So no, I was always interested. I always, for example, read the Bible and read the Bhagavad Gita and read the Quran and all the others, mainly because I found them all fascinating in literature. I was really involved in literature, both English literature and global literature, and very fascinated and intrigued in that, but not really with any religious connection. The Jesus God side of Christianity was of really no interest to me at all. The story and the various assorted stories fascinated me, and likewise with the Quran and all the other ones.
Okay, so throughout your life, you've never believed in a God?
Well, I don't think the word believed is the right one. I strongly believe that there is much more to life and the world and humanity than we can understand or explain. But I don't attach myself to any particular philosophy of what that other thing is, because none of them know it. People either believe in something or they say there is nothing there, which is equally stupid in my opinion. There's no way our minds, which are tiny little things, only fractionally larger than ants and miles smaller than elephants and whales, can cope with the concept of what else is there and why we are here. So I keep an open mind, basically thinking there is something else. I don't know whether we will find out what it is after death or not. I also don't really care, and I live my life according to what I can see and touch and know and experience, rather than believing in anything.
Okay, so you've said that the belief that there's nothing there is absurd, and you disagree with it. What does that something consist of? Or are you going to go for the we can never know angle on this question?
I don't think we can ever know until we die, and possibly not then. But whatever it is something that's beyond our comprehension. I'm afraid as mere mortals, there is no way that we can gather the information. So all I do is I live my life with a very strict morality, entirely depending on what I can see and know and experience and think about and work out, and not by any set of rules or imaginations or beliefs, which I think is dangerous, because you're then latching on to somebody else's code of morality and behaviour, which is never, in my opinion, suitable for us as individuals.
Okay, well, talk a little bit more about the music. When I've read about your life, it seems that you were very driven from quite an early age to go into the music industry. Is that fair to say?
Yes, although it wasn't at the time conscious. What it really was I think I was driven from the very early days into communication. And I think communication encompassed music as well as lots of other things. I was thinking I would eventually become a writer, which I have done in many ways. wasn't aware of the fact that writing would, of course, as it eventually did, contain things like lyrics, which are a very important part of music, and not generally acknowledged nearly enough, in my opinion. The amount of credit given to Bacharach, and I could tell you a few stories about him, and the few amount of credit given to Hal David is quite frightening. And that happens all the time. I was just watching a show on Don Black, who was another great lyricist on television, thinking to myself, they never give lyricists credit. It's always the melody creators who get the credit. Elton John and Bernie Taupin, for example. So I didn't realise then, but what I then grew to realise is, yes, I was really fascinated by communication between human beings and other species, and for that reason, I got very hooked on all sorts of areas of communication. My love for music was just entirely that of a fan, exactly as you've described as first discovering my music. And you will know from the box set, the very first song that hooked me into it was a song called Singing the Blues by a singer in America called Guy Mitchell. And I got hooked into that, and years later did my own version of that, which is on the box set.
Okay, so you were a solo artist from 1965 onwards, but also you developed the knack of releasing music under pseudonyms. What was your rationale for doing so?
Well, I tell people all sorts of different stories about that, but the real rationale was I made so many tracks that I thought were interesting and deserved to be hits, but more important, that deserved to be played on the radio. And I was well aware of the fact that people wouldn't play more than one song at a time on the radio by the same person. So by creating other names and pseudonyms, I was able to put records out that got play on merit, which was another part of it. I didn't want people playing a record because they thought, oh, it's got the word Beatles on it, it must be good, we'll play it, without ever even listening to it or thinking about it. I wanted people to play my records on the radio because they thought they were great records, and it therefore satisfied me that they had names like the Weathermen or Shag or the Piglets or whoever on the label, and they thought was a completely new, brand new group, which quite often amused me. And they would then play the records with the result that I could have, and indeed did have at some point, as many as, I think, 3 records in the top 10 at the same time under different names.
Wow.
Which was very satisfying for me.
And following the 1970s, you went more into television, and Entertainment USA have said is, one of my earliest televisual memories. Were you getting disenchanted with the music industry at this stage?
I got a bit disenchanted. Music was going so well for me with bands like Genesis and 10cc and everything, the Rocky Horror Show, the Bay City Rollers and so on. I was doing incredibly well, and as a result, my lawyers, who became very close friends, especially in America, said to me, you really ought to form your own label. So that's when, in the early 70s, I formed the label UK Records. And we put out loads of records that had loads of hits on UK Records, the biggest of which was probably 10cc. And 10cc were 4 guys who together made magical music. So I spent quite a lot of my funds and budgeting and my monies into making them popular and successful, which we did manage to achieve. They had a #1 track called Rubber Bullets and loads of other great songs. The Wall Street Shuffle is fantastic. I'm still friends with all 4 of them, actually. I had lunch with Graham Gouldman only a few weeks ago. But then, after about 2 years or 3 years, the group, who were, of course, mixing with other groups, began knowing that they were paid a far lower royalty by me than most of the other groups were, because we were a little label and we couldn't afford to spend more money on things like royalties. in the early days when it cost a fortune to break artists. So as a result, they started getting wooed by Richard Branson and Virgin for a start, and then the Polygram people and various others trying to tempt the group to break contract and leave my label and go on to bigger and better things with bigger corporations, which the group fell for and eventually did. And that really disillusioned me with the industry side of the music business. Because I thought, well, hang on a moment, I'll spend a fortune here and then lose the acts at the end of it all. It's just not worth doing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember having the single Worst Band in the World by 10cc, which was, of course, on your label.
Yes, that was actually my favourite 10cc track, funnily enough.
So apps that you actively promoted and invested in were getting poached by big music corporations. That led you to focus perhaps more on your television work into the 80s.
Yes, exactly, because I was doing I was decided to piss off and live in my apartment in America, which had been my basic record label, UK Records label in America, with my apartment attached to it. And I was at that point very involved with the person who went on to be the love of my life, and he wanted to come to America as well. So he actually moved in with me in America into what had been the other half of the apartment, like the business office and so on, which was very satisfactory for both of us. He had a job outside the music industry working for Sotheby's, the auctioneers, and that fitted very well. And at that time, I was appearing on television over there a lot, talking about British things, because I was on a radio station with a top-rated radio show on talk radio, just chatting away about things other than music. And because I was on TV so much now, I became quite a celebrity in New York and started doing these chart rundowns from America once every 3 or 4 weeks for Top of the Pops. And that was so successful that I then thought, well, you know what? I could do a regular half-hour show on America, on the music in America, but also on films and interviewing celebrities and so on, and going round all the different cities in America, looking at them. And it would be a very interesting show, easy to put together with the BBC local crew that were based in America. They loved the idea. The BBC loved the idea. On came Entertainment USA, went straight to the top of the ratings, had about 10 million viewers a week. And yes, I moved into the world of television and sort of slightly away from the world of music, although I did continue to be linked to music because I loved it and people wanted me to stay part of it.
Yeah, so you were involved behind the scene, or you carried on being involved with the music scene after that. For example, helping out with the Eurovision Song Contest one year, is that right?
Yes, indeed. I took over various things that were collapsing. The first, I think, was the Brits, which became a total failure. They were then called the British Rock and Pop Awards, sponsored by the Daily Mirror. And I took those over because they were failing dismally and had a couple of years when they were a disaster. I created the name The Brits, which stands for the British Record Industry Trust Show, BRITS, and I produced and wrote that, and that was a huge success. I was then approached if I'd look after Eurovision, because funnily enough, at that time I wanted to take over Top of the Pops, which was dying, and I knew why it was dying, so I wanted to take it over and sort that out. However, they'd already promised that to somebody else, so sadly, the show then proceeded to die. But Eurovision, which I took over, in my first year, I managed to get a mixed race group featuring for the UK, various different skin colours and genders, which I thoroughly approved of, and was delighted because there was a sort of pirate station at the time. I think it was just legal, called, I think, Kiss FM at the time, based in London. And our entry was the number one, the most requested track on that station, which was brilliant because the station almost entirely had a hip-hop, soul, rap kind of fan base with young kids. So I was managing to get Eurovision involved with the younger generation and mixed races and so on. But we only came 10th in the contest. So the year after, I came up with what I thought was the best ever UK entry for Eurovision, Gina Jean, with a song called Ooh, Ah, Just a Little Bit. And that only came 8th. To my amazement, I later worked out it was because she wasn't a very good performer. And, of course, it's a television show, so you need to have a great performer as well.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was so disappointed by that I resigned. And the BBC begged me to stay. And I said, OK, I'll give it one last try. Got a great performer, a friend of mine called Katrina, who with her waves had a great hit called Walking on Sunshine. She was a bit older and very experienced and knew how to sell a song. And a song called Love Shine a Light. And we won with the biggest in ratio amount of 12 points ever in Eurovision. And that was the last time the UK won Eurovision.
Excellent. Now, any analysis of your life is got to include matters from 2001 onwards. And on the podcast, we listen respectfully to people's opinions and we hear people out. We don't shout them down. What's your summary of the difficulties that you've faced since 2001?
Well, it really started in 2000, actually, when I was arrested in November, I think, of that year, and accused of having had sex with various young men who were under the age of 16. This was not true, but actually, what I gather since is I was offered around that time, about the middle of that year, the global chairmanship of EMI Records. Now, EMI Records was one of the two huge British labels. Decca was one that I'd been on in the 60s and 70s and so on, before UK Records. EMI was the other that had the Beatles and various others from that. And I decided, you know what, I think I could turn this around a bit because EMI was really not doing well. So I accepted the job at a salary of, I think what was then $5 million a year.
Wow.
For 10 years guaranteed. Now, which was then a lot of money. But it wasn't the money, it was the challenge and the fact that I thought I could do a really good job. I have heard since that several of the executives who were very worried with me taking it over, quite rightly so, because I would have fired them all, they were useless, got together, and one of them, in fact, I'm told, I can't prove this, but this is what I've heard, the wife of one of them had a very good friend called Max Clifford. Max Clifford was a rather dodgy publicist who was quite involved in sort of matters like footballers' wives making complaints to newspapers and so on. Anyway, Max Clifford managed to find somebody who was prepared to make, which was completely false, an allegation against me, and as a result, I got arrested and indeed was convicted of his claim or a couple of other claims, and that changed the direction of the course of my career, including really basically me losing the music industry. Unfortunately, it was a very easy thing for them to do because from an early age I decided I was bisexual. I liked both female and males. I liked people, all of whom had to be over the age of 16, which was the age of consent for females. But at that time, unbelievably, having sex with someone of the same gender as yourself, if you were male, was completely illegal and a crime, and you went to prison. And that remained the case right the way through the 60s, the early 60s, and the later 60s. It changed if you were both over 21, but it was still illegal if one or other of you was under 21. And it went on all the way through to the 90s, when I think the age was changed to 18. And then in 2000, oddly enough, a few days after my arrest, the European Union forced the UK to equalise the ages of consent for females and males at 16. But since I was deliberately ignoring that, what I thought ludicrous situation that males and females had different ages of consent, I was fairly easily accused of being trapped into that situation of having broken the age of consent laws at the time. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that is basically what happened.
Okay, so what you're saying is that although technically you broke the law was an ass.
Yes, and the law got changed so that after they changed things, they put in a clause which I didn't know about, which was unless there had been a complaint made within 12 months of the act happening, though it was no longer a crime. I wasn't aware of that. So actually, I haven't broken the law at all, but I didn't know that at the time.
So tell us what prison was like.
Fabulous. I had a wonderful time. For 3.5 years in Belmarsh and then Maidstone and Elmley for a short while. I enjoyed myself thoroughly. Part of my life is cheering people up. I love cheering people up and making people happy, as you can tell from listening to some of my records, many of which are regarded as a joke. But one way or the other, my records make people happy, even if you don't like them. Like, for example, I couldn't stand Leap Up and Down and Wave Your Knickers in the Air, which I produced in the 70s, but it was a huge hit, sold 450,000 records in England. I couldn't listen to it. Every time it came on the radio, I had to turn it off.
Yeah.
Or Una Paloma Blanca, which was a huge hit for me in 1975. I didn't like it at all, but it sold like crazy. So since I like making people happy and cheering people up, the best place in the world to be able to do that is in prison. So I'm in prison with all these unhappy people, all of whom I cheered up. I had a fabulous time. I was incredibly popular in prison. One of the nicest and greatest times of my life.
Wow, okay. But it must have been difficult for you to have coped with the sense of loss that your career in the music industry had been taken away from you. Was there any sort of sense of loss that you experienced?
Not really, no, because I'm my sort of character is I just shrug my shoulders and get on with things, you know?
Yeah.
If I got diagnosed with cancer, I'd go, well, I don't like having cancer, but I better deal with it. And it was a bit the same. It wasn't my raison d'etre to be in the music industry. It was just one of the aspects of my life that I absolutely adored and loved being in it. And more than that, I would like to say I was very good for the music industry. It's really suffered since they kicked me out. Over the last 24 years, the music industry has become something that isn't nearly as good as it was. For a start, it's no fun anymore. I mean, if the most amusing thing you can have in the music industry these days is Beyonce getting dressed up in a cowboy outfit, you're in real trouble. In fact, I think the word I would use is deep shit. So, yes, I was rather sad because I think the music industry has suffered a lot. If you watch my latest A Victim Bites Back show on all the various sites, including its own dedicated site, you'll see me go into this in quite great length because I did help lots of younger people have big hits in the last decade and the decade before that, and I go into that and play them at quite great length. So I'm still sort of vaguely connected. I've got lots of friends still in it and everything. But what happened when I was suddenly thrown into prison? Obviously, initially, I thought, oh my God, this is the end. My life is ended. I'm going to be locked up in prison. Nobody will respect me any longer. And then I thought, well, hang on a moment. I don't care if nobody respects me. The only people I want to like and respect me are people I know and like, my friends, all of whom stuck by me, with a couple of exceptions, right? So why am I worried about that? My life is still here. I've still got my health. I've still got my stunning good looks. I can say that. This is on the radio and you can't see me. And I thought, well, get on with the next part of my life. And so I got on with being the best, the finest prisoner there has ever been. And that, by the way, isn't just coming from me. It's coming from many of the governors and the chaplains and the staff at the prisons I was in, all of whom said, "My God, thank heavens you're here, JK. You've changed the entire place." So, no, I had a wonderful time. And I have to tell you, unfortunately, Robert, it's now reached 3:30 and two of my friends from Eurovision are about to appear at my door, and they expecting me to make them a Pimm's and to celebrate a lovely sunny day we've got.
Okay, we have to stop there then, do we?
I wouldn't mind if it's okay with you. You've had half an hour of me. Most people don't want 5 minutes of me.
Well, it'll be good to just ask some wrap-up questions some other time. So I'm guessing another 10, 15 minutes. Is that going to be okay at some point?
That's absolutely fine, but it will have to be in 10 to 15 minutes because I suspect I can actually see on my camera my doorbell is about to ring.
Okay.
Yes, you let me know when another convenient time and then send me the thing. I must now go to my door. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And that brings us to the somewhat abrupt conclusion of my conversation with Jonathan King. Since our initial chat back in the spring, I've been in contact with Mr. King on several occasions, but unfortunately, due to his busy schedule, we weren't able to arrange a follow-up to complete the episode. One topic I had hoped to explore further was whether he had any regrets about his relationships with younger males. Although I didn't get the chance to ask directly, a quick dive into public records shows that Mr. King has gone on record saying he has no regrets about any of his actions over the course of his life. In our conversation, he defended himself by pointing out that the law discriminated against him as a gay man. He noted that while it was legal for a man to engage in relationships with a 16-year-old girl, his own homosexual encounters were treated differently. There is a kernel of validity in this claim. After all homosexuality was illegal in the UK until the 1960s, and at various points in history, laws have also banned practices like Catholicism, abortion, blasphemy, gambling or divorce, all of which are now widely accepted. However, it's also important to consider the ethics of a much older, wealthier and more powerful person taking advantage of someone younger and impressionable. During Mr. King's original trial, for example, the prosecution argued that he promised young men introductions to stars like Samantha Fox, a popular topless model in the 1980s and someone Mr. King briefly dated, as a way of manipulating them. I remember reading a piece in which a friend of Mr. King paraphrased, "Poor Jonathan. Everyone was doing it in the 70s. He just got caught." And indeed, the music industry has a long history of older figures dating much younger individuals. Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, for example, famously and openly had a 14-year-old girlfriend in the early 1970s. That being said, while two wrongs don't excuse each other, there is an argument to be made that homophobia may have played a role in Mr. King's conviction. He faced prison time, while some of his heterosexual peers faced little to no consequence for similar behaviour. Still, when it comes to passing moral judgment, strangely, we'll adopt the stance of Jesus. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Next week, we'll be turning our attention back more explicitly to the intersection of religion and society. Given the tensions that arose this summer between the Muslim community and far-right activists, we'll be talking to Paul Armstrong, Managing Director of the Association of British Muslims, for a timely discussion. In the absence of a second conversation, Mr. King himself suggested we play some of his music to close out this episode. I'll leave you with a track that many of you will recognise as the theme to his 1980s TV show, Entertainment USA. However, the song, titled I'll Slap Your Face, was originally released much earlier as a solo effort on his UK records label. While it didn't initially chart, it found some success when it became the show's theme. Until next time, this is the Unsure Podcast signing off. Enjoy I'll Slap Your Face.